last 3 years, and I handed over the chain of office at our AGM to one of your own, Jimmy Dean. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Jimmy into the role of President and to hand him over the chain of office. And I suppose on a personal note, I must say that I'm absolutely delighted that Jimmy is taking over from me, because Jimmy has been a member of the Society for many, many years and has always been a great friend to the Society. So congratulations, Jimmy, and best of luck for the next 3 years.
Thank you very much, Marion. She contacted me a couple of months ago now would I take on this job, and I did my best to divert her to somebody else. But anyway, I'm deeply honoured to have been acknowledged and to be offered the position, because it's a very, very important position in our county. As you know, the Kerry Archaeological Historical Society goes back to 1967, and it produced a very important journal and a magazine. And the journal is considered one of the top academic journals in the whole country's gas history. And good for it, we'd have lost an awful lot of history, very important history and sources in our county. So we owe a great deal of gratitude to Kerry Archaeological and Historical Society. So I'm looking forward to 3 years, and hopefully there'll be a lot more events up here in the school as well, because North Kerry, as you know, is steeped in history. And I just look at the audience tonight. There are so many historians down here in our audience, a lot of published historians in the audience as well, and people with a really genuine interest in North Kerry and its history, especially social history. We're really honoured tonight. We have 3 Hewson families here. The family are here. There's Bill, William, and Natalie. So just stand up and acknowledge them. Bill is a grandson of George's.
Yes.
So that's very close. So we're really very honoured. Great grandson, yeah. We're honoured to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And also, we have another family here. I just noticed it coming in the door. The people that took over your farm back in Ennismore, the Collisons. And Marty is here with her 4 children here. So anyway, it's my pleasure to meet Tom Dillon. I know Tom since he was a very small boy, because our Bob was here, his family Dillon's down below, and also we had Meadow down that was formerly belonged to the Hewsons, and that we got in some land division back in 1903 or whatever. So I know Tom all over that period of time, and I must say Tom has an amazing, I suppose, background. He has a master's degree in history from UL, first-class honours, and now he's going on and doing a PhD, his doctorate, on this subject. So it's great. I know we have a number of historians here this evening from Kerry. Tom is one of the up-and-coming historians, and he's one of our real superstars. He's our kind of human further, I suppose. This man here, we all heard a lot about him, Josh Hewson, when we were growing up. He was very much a huge figure, actually, in the community over the years. People refer to him all the time. And the song will outline to you his major role he played in bringing wages to North Kerry, for example. And Michael Gale is here, the man who wrote the history of the RT. But George Hewson, more than anyone, that brought the RT to North Kerry. And also the mainline railway. He was the man that saved Ballybunion Golf Course. Only for him, we were in a golf course in Ballybunion. It was George, again, it was his initiative that created the golf course in Ballybunion. And also, he was an innovator in agriculture, and he was a guy right across the country as being one of the great scientists and innovators in agriculture. So, forward to Tom's lecture here this evening and enjoy it. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Jimmy. I just was thinking to myself, when I said to Jimmy earlier, it was like waiting to run onto the pitch with all our just one more before I start tonight, just to say it's a huge personal honour to be here tonight and to go and see so many neighbours and friends and my family as well, and also the Hewsons and so many other people that I know. Special welcome to everyone. And again, just to mention that it's a huge honour as well for me to do this while I'm serving as the Kerry Council historian and residence, because this is a very personal link to history for me, because my family came to Ennismore when the Hewsons left, and they lived in a part of Ennismore House for about 10 years, and it was there that my grandparents met. And I grew up listening to our neighbours at home talk about the Hewsons, talk good about them, because they were known as good landlords and good people who looked after the people who worked for them. So I'll talk for about an hour. I hope no one falls asleep, and we'll take some questions then. So George Hewson of Ennismore was one of the most prominent public figures in County Kerry during the 19th century. Can everyone hear me now, actually? Yeah. He lived the lifestyle of the gentry at Ennismore House and epitomised the often overlooked and unacknowledged role of the resident gentry in the development of localities all over Ireland. So much of the land of Ireland was owned by absentee landlords who never lived here, but people like George Hewson did. And it was on their shoulders that all, as Jimmy outlined, all the railways, the agricultural development, the tourism industries, all these things that developed and gave good to the communities where they came from. George Hewson was a deputy lieutenant, he was a grand juror, a magistrate, a fishery conservator, he was also a member of the Stole Board of Guardians, and he was a railway director. As well as that, he was a gentleman farmer. And this meant that he derived his income from agriculture, and he became known far and wide for his success in butter production, cattle breeding and the reclamation of land. His experiences during the famine years drove his desire to help the poor by providing work, which in turn helped improve the agricultural condition of his estates and at the same time increase the prosperity of the wider community. He promoted the tourism industry in Ballybunion. He established the railways in North Kerry, and he set up export links to Great Britain, which benefited the local area well beyond his lifetime, even up to the present day. All of these achievements and more saw George Hewson extolled as an example to follow, and it led to him being dubbed the Prince Farmer of North Kerry. So born in November 1812, George Hewson was the second surviving son of Captain John Francis Hewson of Ennismore and Elizabeth Hewson, who came from Castle Hewson, Askeaton, County Limerick. He was the fourth generation of his family to reside at Ennismore, 4 miles west of the Stole, and the locality is also situated at the confluence of the two big rivers of North Kerry, the Field and the Gale. Ennismore House contained 22 rooms and was one of the biggest houses in North Kerry. Originally, it was built in the 1600s by John Fitzgerald, the 12th Knight of Kerry. However, it was enlarged and expanded over the years by successive generations of the Hewson family. This photograph was taken by a man from Tralee who passed away recently, and I should mention him at the start because he was a huge influence in encouraging me in history, and that was Russell McMorran. And it shows Ennismore House sitting in the landscape with the trees, many of the trees that Hewsons would have planted, and the lawn in front of it. The house was approached by an avenue of trees and 2 entrance lodges, and this announced its grandeur and status of the Hewsons to all who travelled by. Among the visitors to Ennismore were Charles Stewart Parnell, the noted antiquarian and Church of Ireland Bishop of Limerick, Arthur Charles Graves. They were also visited at Ennismore by the Earl of the Stole and also their cousin Peter Fitzgerald, Knight of Kerry. Lord Kitchenell's family were also friends of the Hewsons. Beautiful pleasure grounds surrounded Ennismore House with plantations of trees. This is the gate lodge, which still stands. And there were plantations plantations of trees on which grew carpets of wild garlic and bluebells which flowered in the spring. There were also two conservatories where indoor plants and vines were grown. There was a kitchen garden where vegetables and fruit was grown, and also several acres of orchards containing apples and pear trees. Beauty of Bath was one of the apple varieties, and this was a cooking apple, but there were other varieties of apples which were used to make cider. George Hewson was a member of the Kerry Horticultural Society. I nearly said Archaeological Historical Society there, I was wrong. And his garden contained plants from all over the world, including rhododendrons which came from the Himalayas, and they are a common plant to be found in avenues of great houses all over Ireland. But also on the drive leading up to Ennismore House grew a monkey puzzle tree, and this was a native of South America. There were also walnut trees and Irish yews. Inside the house, a library of books impressed on visitors the taste and education of the Hewson family. On display would have been medals and cups won by George Hewson at various agricultural shows, and also silver cups won by his greyhounds in the top-class coursing meetings of the 1860s. He was a well-known sportsman and was regarded as the best tandem whip in Kerry. So a tandem whip meant that he would have the horses one in front of the other. He was a regular on the hunting field throughout his life, and he rode on horseback right up to his 84th year. When he died, he actually caught a cold when he was out riding, and that's what claimed his life in the finish. It was in November 1833 that he was riding on the seashore out in Ballygunion, and he was 22 years old at that time. And there was a ship travelling between Tarbert and London, and it was caught in a storm off the head and washed onto the rocks near the Black Rocks. And the sea was so rough, no boat could go out to set the rescue the sailors. But George Hewson rode out through the sea on his horse, and he brought four of them to safety. So, hanging on the walls of his residence in Ennismore would have been portraits of his ancestors. Among them this man, a Cromwellian soldier named Colonel John Hewson. Famously, he rose from the rank of a cobbler to be a colonel in the army of Oliver Cromwell during the Civil War. He later signed the death warrant of King Charles I and went on to become governor of Dublin and be made a lord by Cromwell. All the Hewson families of Ireland, including the branches at Ennismore, Fluke and Castle Hewson, proudly claim descent from him. Portraits of the Fitzgeralds and Knights of Kerry also decorated the walls of Ennismore House. And it was through Margaret, this woman, the daughter of Morris, the 14th Knight of Kerry, that the Hewsons came to Ennismore. It was in 1737 that she married John Hewson from Castle Hewson, Askeaton, County Limerick. And there's a very romantic story of how the two of them first met. The roads of the country were so bad at that time that it was very uncomfortable to travel by coach, so people travelled on horseback instead. And Margaret was riding her horse down through County Limerick when it fell lame, or else it lost a shoe. There were variations to the story. And she was a lot's what to do when a young man came away, John Hewson, and he came to her assistance. He gave her the loan of his horse, and he walked by her side to the house of a friend. So that first meeting led to an attachment, and eventually they were married. The Hewsons leased Ennismore from the Knight of Kerry, and they remained there as tenants, even when the ownership of the estate changed in 1766. Because it was in that year that the Hare family purchased the estate, and they would therefore become the Earls of Bristol. So what's interesting is that despite the long association of the Hewson family with Ennismore, they never actually owned it. They were always there as tenants. And this was often replicated in many other gentry houses in North Kerry. The Hickeys of Killetton would be another example. And other houses, even out the road here, like the Cooks and Hollands and those as well. But even though the Hewsons didn't own Ennismore, they could claim a long and distinguished history of the place because of their descent from the Knights of Kerry. Now the Hewson tenancy at Ennismore always operated under a lease of lives. And when a new lease was signed in 1819, when George was just 8 years old, the duration was specified as 24 years or the life of George Hewson. So he was the third son in the family, and as was the tradition that time, the older sons would be educated or maybe sent off. The younger ones would, and then inherit the land. The next ones then would be educated maybe for going into the army or the clergy. But George, it would seem, even from this age, his destiny was to be a farmer. By the 1830s, he gained a considerable knowledge about agriculture by educating himself and learning from the example of men in the locality who came before him. So Pierce Mahoney of Kilmorna would have been one who advocated the introduction of improved methods of farming, and he would have done this by the breeding of livestock and the cultivation of crops. And George's granduncle, this man, Robert Fitzgerald, 17th knight of Kerry, he lived outside the town in Ballinmudry, and in his lifetime he would have been an improving farmer, and it was he who introduced the Scotch plough to Kerry, and also he promoted the improved breeds of cattle and sheep, notably the Kerry cattle. When George Hewson's father died at Ennismore in September 1847, George took up the property, and with it a number of other farms. The Hewsons also had land out in Tree Europe, and they also had farms in Ballyrahan. But by 1883, George Hewson's estates in County Kerry comprised 5 different properties and amounted to just over 3,900 acres. A lot of this he leased, some of it he owned. So the family seat at Ennismore lay on an estate of 1,200 acres, while George also had a farm of 177 acres on the other side of the River Field at Ballyhorgan. His biggest holding was situated around the seaside resort of Ballybunion, 9 miles from the Stole area. His estate here measured 1,794 acres and took in most of the village of Ballybunion and the sandhills which stretched from its outskirts to the mouth of the River Cashin. Now, a valuable asset of his estate in Ballybunion was the fisheries which adjoined his property. And the fishery on his property at Bally was a highly lucrative resource. This was the fishery at the mouth of the Cashin. And this was a prime fishing position because his nets would have been the very first to meet the migrating salmon as they entered the river system. So just an example of the income he earned from from the fishery in Ballybunion. In 1869, over 11,157 salmon were caught. That's a lot of salmon. I think in the hundreds that are caught now then. And this, all those salmon earned George Hewson £1,948. So that's quite a lot of money. And if you compare that then to the salmon which he sold in his fishery 6 miles upriver at Ennismore, £271. So the fact that he had a fishery at the mouth of the river, this was very valuable. And it was the fishery rights which were a constant source of dispute between Hewson and the inhabitants of the surrounding localities near his estate. There was a degree of animosity towards him from the locals in the Dyshot area, and he was known to them as the Lion of Ennismore. Not because he had the mutton chops beard, but because he was always rolling them to get out of his fishery. Other accounts name him as the Bull of Ennismore for the same reason. In 1843, there was a disagreement over fishing rights in the River Field, and this led to an attempt on his life. He was returning home by horse and trap one moonlit night when he passed 2 people clad in shawls on the road. And as he passed them, one of them threw off their shawl and leveled a gun at him and fired. Now they missed, and he managed to gallop away to safety. So subsequently, a father and son named Morris and Patrick Drury were convicted of attempted murder and transported to Van Diemen's Land. Now local folklore holds this was a miscarriage of justice, being a case of mistaken identity. The only evidence found against the 2 men was that when their house was searched by the police that night, their shoes were wet. So, most of the land in George Hewson's possession was farmed by him himself, and a survey of the rate books from the time showed that of the 3,900 acres that he held, he farmed 2,800 of them himself and rented out the remaining roughly 1,000. So this shows that George was a gentleman farmer, which meant he worked the land himself and earned his income from farming rather than from rents. and that's what would have differed him from many other landlords. Due to the extensive amount of land he occupied as a farmer, George was the 5th highest ratepayer in County Kerry in 1885. And he was placed higher on the list of ratepayers than men like the Earl of Listowel and the Earl of Kenmare, who won hundreds of thousands of acres, and likewise Henry Arthur Herbert, who won thousands of acres as well. And because George Pay was one of the biggest ratepayers, he was regularly called to serve on the county grand jury. Membership of this was a very prestigious honour, because the grand juries operated like the county parliament. They were the forerunners of the county councils, and the council would have replaced them under the Local Government Act in 1898. So in Kerry, the grand jury met in Trinity Courthouse, and they met twice every year at spring and summer assizes. These would have been held in March and July. And the grand jury would consist then of 23 of the biggest ratepayers in the county. They would be chosen by the High Sheriff, and they were empowered to raise a local tax known as the county cess, and this would have been spent on roads and bridges and public buildings. The connection between this public office, George's public role as a grand juror, and the land is interesting, because it shows how the land will have influence on one's place in society. Specific landed income was stipulated by law in order to serve in the grand jury, and also in other roles like as a magistrate or indeed as a deputy lieutenant. But whatever status public office might have given George Hewson, it would have been his reputation as an agriculturalist that enabled him to mix with people far beyond his own sphere of life. And this would have included people such as the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VII. George Hewson was reputedly the biggest dairy farmer in Munster, and his holding in Ennismore was described as one of the most successful and well-managed farms in the south of Ireland. During the period around 1880, he was farming 200 to 300 dairy cattle and was producing up to 30 firkins of butter every week. By 1890, his head of cows increased to 400. And when I was this morning, when I was looking at what pictures to put on the slideshow presentation here, it kind of struck me that this one was eating cows by hand. So imagine the effort it would take to meet 400 cows twice a day. Imagine that now. That's a lot of work. So butter production was the predominant agricultural activity in Munster at this time, and it formed Ireland's largest agricultural export. The butter produced on George Hewson's farms was well known as a first-class brand. He exported it twice a week to the London market, where it fetched the highest price and earned him an estimated £3,000 annually. He led the way in adopting new and more economical methods of butter production. So this machine here is called a cream separator, and George Hewson would have brought the first one of these to Kerry, and he would be one of the very few in Ireland who actually would have won them, and this would have been in the 1880s. And he also had one on his farm in Ennismore, and he had another one on his farm in Ballygummy. And you can see the woman there with the churn. I mean, that would have been a lot of manual labour against water by that method. And also the milk had to be left sit in large tubs for up to a day while the separation process happened naturally. However, the cream separator used centrifugal force, which meant by spinning around, to extract a higher proportion of cream from the milk during the butter production process. And this reduced the time it took to make the butter, it produced more quantity, and also a more superior quality. There was a demonstration of this new implement at the Royal Agricultural Society show in Kilburn. London in 1879, which was attended by George Hewson and other Kerry landowners. And during his stay in London for the show, he was among the representatives of the landowners and tenant farmers of the south of Ireland who were invited to Marlborough House by the Prince of Wales. George Hewson's knowledge of the butter trade in the south of Ireland saw him called to give evidence to a parliamentary inquiry in London in 1882. And he also gave evidence to the Royal Commission on Agriculture as well as commissions on horse breeding and the construction of railways. The cream separator was not the first piece of modern agricultural equipment to be introduced to the county by George Hewson. In 1857, he brought the first threshing machine to the county. This was brought from England and it costed several £100 and it was drawn by horses, and he also had a steam engine as well. The machine drew considerable attention when it arrived in Kerry, and it was rented out by George to different landowners around the county to thresh their corn. And on one occasion it was sent back to Ballinor in Tralee, and it kind of drew spectators from all over to watch it. There were some farming implements once owned by George Hewson, which are known to have persisted for many years afterwards in the locality. And in 1962, this horse plough was still in use in Ballybunion, having been first brought to the area by George Hewson in 1849. From the 1840s through to the 1880s, George Hewson enjoyed considerable success in competitions organised by various local and national agricultural societies. The County Kerry Agricultural Society, which was run under the auspices of the Royal Agricultural Society of Ireland, they had shows at various places around the county, and George won countless medals for his cultivation of crops, and these included flax, turnips, mangels, parsnips, carrots, and green crops such as clover, and this would have been acres of crops now. Along with this, he was also recognised for his livestock breeding, winning medals for the best colt and filly, the best sow, boar, ram, sheep, and cattle. His prized short-horn bulls had names such as Lord of the Dales, Robin Hood, and Prince Albert. And the names of other bulls are interesting as well, because they suggest a nod to members of his own family. So he had a prize cow called Lily, which was his wife's name. Imagine they had a fight. Midshipman, his bull Midshipman, may well have been named after his uncle Maurice Hewson, who had served in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. And he was captured at that time by the French and escaped, and he later wrote a book about his account. George had another short-horn bull called Admiral, and this may well have been named in honour of his other uncle, who was also called George, and he had served in the Royal Navy and fought on HMS Dreadnought at the Battle of Trafalgar. He later moved on to become an admiral. Because George was such an important figure, he was also a target for the White Boys during the Land War, and it was said he never left the house without a revolver, carrying a revolver. And it must indicate that he had a sense of humour on his part, because he called one of his bulls Moonlighter. And also he had a black Berkshire boar called White Boy. So George also won medals for the best managed farm and also the best drainage work. Among the breeds of cattle kept by George Hewson on his estate at Ennismore were Kerry cattle, along with Shorthorns, Devons, Ayrshires, and a black breed of Dutch cow. Shorthorn bulls were purchased from the famous herd at Alfort Abbey, and crosses between these animals and the Kerry cattle were widely valued at the time, because it was considered our offspring were well adapted to fattening as well as the dairy. For over 50 years, he was a judge of livestock at the Royal Dublin Society Spring Shows. This would have been a prestigious event now in the calendar in Ireland at the time. And he also acted as judge for the Royal Agricultural Society of Ireland at their cattle shows all over the country. This would have been in places like Cork, Limerick, Galway, Killarney, Sligo and Ballinasloe. He also judged cattle at competitions in England, and in 1882 exhibited at the Irish exhibition in Olympia, London. On show were butter and churns from his dairy in Ennismore, along with a very pretty dairy maid. On another occasion, he acted as livestock judge at an exhibition in Newcastle upon Tyne, and this had been held to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria's reign. But George was sent over with the Kerry cattle as part of the exhibit, and they attracted quite a lot of attention, among them from the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VII, this man. The Prince, George Hewson, must have been a great ambassador for the Kerry cattle, because the Prince bought 2 Kerry cows immediately for his own dairy, and his mother, Queen Victoria, also purchased them for her herd at Sandringham. When George Hewson's father died in 1847, he succeeded him as tenant in Ennismore, and he began to vastly improve the property. Ennismore House, the old offices, and the land were all in a wretched condition, and it was through their improvement that George established for himself his renown as an improving farmer. Almost 2/3 of the 1,200-acre estate consisted of bog and marsh, which was included in the rent, but this made no income, or made no contribution to the estate's income. He was paying for it, but he was making no profit out of that land. So, it was said that the annual profit out of Ennismore at that particular time was less than a first-class steward's wages. They even struggled to pay the rent. They had to pay the rent from butter to the hour of soul. George's approach to farming was like a business, and all his activities were driven towards making a profit. As tenant in Ennismore, he had rent to pay and also a standard of lifestyle to maintain, suitable to his position in society. So it was important to work his estate to its maximum profitability or productivity. The marshes all along the rivers were drained, and the land bounding the bog was reclaimed and turned into pasture land. This meant George could keep more dairy cattle and expand his production of butter, which he exported to the British market and thereby earned him more income. His success in reclamation work and estate management became the inspiration for farmers all over Ireland and beyond. Some of them even travelled to Ennismore to inspect the work that he had done. And in this way, he was held up as a modern landlord, and he gained a reputation for himself as a celebrated agriculturalist. As a mark of his self-sufficiency and economy, many of the clay pipes that George used in his drainage work in Ennismore were actually manufactured on the estate itself. There's a field in our locality at home that's called the Toilery, and this was where the drainage pipes and also bricks were made and burned in a kiln. George also owned a large boat called a lighter, and this would travel down the river field from Ennismore down to the mouth of the river at the Cashin. They would load the boat with sand and then come back up the river with the tide. There was a quay on the riverbank then opposite the gate of Ennismore. And sand was used that time to spread on the land to help improve the soil quality and drainage. And likewise, the limestone was also acquired at Ennismore, and it was born in 2 of these lime kilns, which were built by George Hewson. The roads were also built through the estate, trees planted, hedgerows made, and pumps for water sunk. There was a range of new farm buildings erected in the farmyard at Ennismore, which were noted as the finest in the county. This building was known as the Long Stall, and it stretched the whole length of the northern side of the farmyard at Ennismore. And there was a bell in the eastern gable, up in the eastern gable, and this was a pump called workers into the fields. Under the bell there was a steam house, there was a kitchen, there was also a dairy, and also stalls for 110 cattle. And running the whole length of the building then was a hayloft. It was in this building that the hub of George Hewson's famed butter production took place. In 1852, George got together with some other gentlemen from the neighbourhood of the Stole, and they started up a direct butter trade with London. They chartered a ship from Towers to take it by sea to the London market. Later, the butter, along with the salmon caught in the fisheries, were transported by horse and cart to Glynn, where they were sold to the fish merchants down there, the pilgrims. And from there, they were put onto the steamships that operated up and down the Shannon. They were taken to Limerick, where they were put on the train and dispatched by rail for Waterford, bound for Billingsgate Market in London. Now, from the 1850s, there were moves to build a railway through West Limerick and North Kerry, connecting Newcastle West to Tralee. George Hewson was one of those who drove the project, and he served as a director on the Kerry Railway. This opened in 1880 and was a huge benefit to the economy of the whole district. The route of the railway passed through George Hewson's farms at Ennismore and Ballygorgan. In recognition of his immense work in bringing over his construction, it was decided that the railway company would grant a flag station to him at the Ennismore level crossing. So just on the other side, that would be the Lixnaw side, there was a platform at the side of the tracks, and the train would stop to collect George Hewson to go to town to hear him sold. From the same platform then during the fishing season, the salmon from the estate fishery would have been loaded onto the train every day, and butter from the Ennismore dairy was sent twice a week by rail to London and Manchester. There was also one famous occasion at this spot in 1885 when the Prince of Wales and his wife were travelling from Canary to Limerick, and they were greeted at Ennismore. The train stopped there, and they were greeted by George Hewson and his wife. So you can imagine this would have been a pretty big event when the royalty would pass through somewhere as rural as Ennismore. The Lartine Railway then, which ran between the Store and Ballygorgan, that was built in 1888, and George Hewson was also a huge influence on its construction. It linked the town here, which was a market town, to the seaside village of Ballygorgan. And George actually met the designer of this railway, Charles Lartine, in London during one of his visits, and he encouraged him to follow through and build the railway. What was unique about it, that people don't know, was that it was built on an A-frame, and it was, if you had a railway out in the desert, the sand would actually go over the tracks if they were flat on the ground. So this actually elevated the whole system and meant that the train could operate through desert conditions. That's kind of not related or unrelated to the workings of this railway company. George actually made huge benefit out of this railway when it opened, because he owned the Santas in Ballygorgan. And the main revenue of this railway was not the tourist passengers travelling out to Ballygorgan, but actually the transport of sand. And again, going back to the boats that travel up and down the river, sand was in huge demand in agriculture at that time. He had an agreement with the railway company, the Lartine Railway Company, to purchase or to sell to them the load of sand for 5 shillings per load. And there was a mechanism by which when the sand was brought into the store on the Lartine, it was empty, the carriages were emptied onto wagons, and on the main line was dispatched to all over Munster and Northern Ireland, I guess. From the 1830s, Ballygorgan became increasingly popular as a seaside resort among the wealthier classes in North Kerry and West Limerick. And many families of the gentry, including the Hewsons, would relocate there during the month of September each year. George's father built the well-known Castle Hotel in the 1830s, while George himself was a huge encouragement to the fledgling tourist economy. He built bathing lodges and a dispensary. He erected water fountains, and he presented a football field. And when the now world famous Ballygorgan Golf Club was founded in August 1893, he permitted the use of the Santas rent-free, and he served as the club's first president. A correspondent to the Kerry Evening Post wrote that George Hewson has spent his life and money making Ballygorgan the beautiful village it is. Now, relations were not always good with the locals in Ballygorgan, however, because folklore in North Kerry recalls that George Hewson clashed with the local parish priest, Father Martin O'Connor. George Hewson, this is the Castle Green, and the grounds of the Castle Green were adjacent to the Castle Hotel which George owned. And he decided at one stage that he wanted to take in this and make it private property. So he erected a gate to block the access by the public. The problem for the priest was that the public used the pathway across the Castle Green to go over to the church in Doon. So when the gate was erected, their path was blocked to mass. So Father O'Connor, it was recalled, tore the gate off its hinges and threw it off the cliff into the tide below. And it was said in Ballybunion that ever since the public have had the right to walk on the castle green. There were other examples as well where he clashed with the priest, but what's remarkable was that when a yard alongside the castle hotel, there was a hay barn in it, an attached house, and this was set fire to by the Moonlighters in the 1880s. And Father O'Connor was among the people of Ballybunion who walked through the night to quench the blaze and stop it spreading to the adjacent Castle Hotel. So you can imagine if the Castle Hotel burned down in a tourist town, the damage that would have caused. So there was common ground between both of them. Across all of George's estates, it was remarked that he had an army of labourers in his employment, and this cost him thousands of pounds every year. His employment was of huge benefit to the men and women of North Kerry and their families, because it gave them an income and a sense of independence, not to mention security from destitution, the workhouse and forced immigration. There was a meeting of the Ballyduff Dispensary Committee in 1880, and it was heard that there were 540 labourers out of employment in the district, every one of whom were on the verge of starvation. It was commented that this number would have been even greater only for the efforts of George Hewson, who had 130 labourers engaged in his employment in the neighbourhood of Ballybunion. Labourers accounted for a large part of the agricultural workforce in late 19th century Ireland, and they played an important role in fulfilling the extensive labour requirements of the estates. So, as I mentioned earlier, imagine the labour it would have taken to milk 400 cows twice every day, and then make butter from the milk. And on top of all that, you had all the other jobs on farms to do, like feeding the livestock, cleaning up the stalls, bedding livestock, fencing fields, and keeping drainage ditches clear, saving hay, planting crops. So there would have been a huge need for labour. And quite rightly, George viewed his relationship with the labourers who worked for him as a cooperative fellowship. He benefited from their labour, and they benefited from his employment. This was one of the labourers' cottages as well on the Ennismore estate, which stood up to 2000. And I want to thank as well the Hewson family who let me use a lot of the photographs, some of the photographs on the slideshow tonight. And Timmy was a great man, he was a big encouragement to me too in taking up history and studying history. And Timmy was very knowledgeable about the locality and history of Ennismore. And every year there was a party held in Ennismore and Ballybunion, which was known as the Harvest Home. And this proved the peaceful and personal relations which existed between the Hewson family and their employees. Tradition holds, remember the long stall, but tradition holds that the Harvest Home in Ennismore was held in the hayloft overhead. And there was also a hay barn in Ballybunion where the dinner was held and dancing afterwards. Reports of the occasions tell how the venues were decorated with evergreens and mottos like Céad Míle Fáilte and God Save the Plough. Not the Queen, interestingly, or the Prince of Wales. The Harvest Home there at Ennismore was frequently attended by up to 200 people, and also along with them were some of the neighbouring gentry families. George Hewson would carve the meat on these occasions, while his wife and children would serve the dinner to their guests. And I think that's remarkable when you consider it's actually turning the Victorian social order on its head, that George, as the master, the employer, would actually do that. His experiences during the famine years, it was recalled, made an indelible impression on his mind. Throughout the rest of his life, he acted to ensure his hardships would never be repeated. In Black 47, a soup kitchen was set up at Ennismore House with the help of the Quakers from Limerick, and every day food was given out to the poor for free. George's father, John Hewson, was chairman of the Restored Relief Committee, which tried to alleviate the distress felt by the poor and the hungry. And George himself was involved in 3 separate committees in Restore, Ballybunion and Kiltomey, which would have operated around the Lixna area. He served as secretary of the Kiltomey Relief Committee, and a letter from 1847 written by him to Dublin Castle survives. In it he asked for a soup boiler, which would be better known to us as a famine pot. And he attached to his letter a list of subscribers from the neighbourhood who had given money towards the famine relief effort. What's remarkable is that many of these names were small farmers and labourers themselves, and they gave sums from as little as a penny or sixpence or a shilling. And when you consider the famine might not have been far from their own doors, that was a big gesture on their part. On the other hand, George then singled out the landowners of the Exnar district, like the Marquess of Lansdowne and the Haring family and the Locks. And none of them put their hand in their pockets to help the famine relief effort, even though they took hundreds of pounds in rent every year from the district. George had no land in the area himself, the area of Exnar, but he gave money from his own pocket to help the relief effort. It was claimed that he often gave every penny he could lay his hands on to help those in distress. Between 1848 and 1857, and this would have covered the famine period, George Hewson employed men with spades on his estate in Ennismore, and he got them to raise the riverbanks by a foot to 18 inches along 5 miles of the river. So the River Gale would have bounded the estate on the northern side and the River Field all the way on the west and the southern sides. So 5 miles with spades digging and raising the riverbanks. And this afforded much needed employment to the labourers of the district, keeping away the famine and the effects of the famine. This work was financed by a loan from the government of £1,000, which was obtained by George Hewson through his landlord, the Earl of Stowe. However, he had to pay the whole cost of it back through the annual rent. So in effect, all that famine labour was paid for out of his own pocket. George Hewson's generosity at that time and that of his sisters was recalled in verse nearly 50 years later by James Carmody. This is James Carmody and his dog. I don't know what the dog's name is. James was a long time, I got this from, I think his great-granddaughter. He was a long-time tenant on the Ennismore estate, and the Carmodys were a family who lived for a long time in Ennismore as well, and were in the employment of the Hewsons. James was at the Harvest Home dinner in Ennismore in 1893, and he sung a song on that occasion composed by himself. Now, I can't sing it because I don't know the Irish, but I know read out the words. And it's about how George helped the poor and hungry in Ennismore at that particular time. Our proud, noble-hearted master is worthy of honour and praise. It is no wonder we would highly respect him if we remember the year 48. We never saw want or starvation, nor poverty cold at our doors. We were fed from his plentiful table in this lovely green isle in Ennismore. I remember the years of the famine that left the poor hungry, naked and cold. Our good master, he never forgot us, nor his charitable sisters also. Our wants they supplied late and airy, and that is no lie I uphold, with bread, beef, mutton and bacon from the mansion of Grand Ennismore. When George Hewson died on the 4th of December 1896, it was stated, and I'm quoting here, "No man in the kingdom of Kerry was more beloved than George Hewson. His passing was said to have cast a dark shadow in the household of many a North Kerry labourer. Other tributes described him as a modern landlord, a fine sportsman, a keen judge of stock, the friend of his tenants, and a kind neighbour whose memory will be cherished by all classes. On the day of his funeral at Ennismore House, there was a huge attendance of people, rich and poor, from all over North Kerry and beyond. There were county gentlemen, his tenants, servants and workmen, and they all joined his family to mourn his loss and accompany him on his last journey. It proved to be a stately occasion. His coffin was removed from his residence by his family, and then a party of police shouldered it down to the avenue to the bank of the River Field. It was then transferred onto a waiting barge, and his body was conveyed for 2 miles down the river in great state to Dycher Churchyard on the opposite side of the river from Ennismore. His final resting place is under the 4 Irish yew trees which stand in the churchyard, where generations of his ancestors, Hewsons and the Fitzgeralds of Kerry, were laid to rest before him. A plaque was later erected in St. John's Church of Ireland in Listowel in his memory by his wife. St. John's just across the door, or the square, and this plaque is inside the door still. It bears the epitaph, "A noble life at rest." And you could say that's pretty fitting by what we've heard tonight. The interest he took in the lives of those placed under him by the will of Providence is in stark contrast to the stereotypical Irish landlord. George's sense of duty and work to promote his home county was also very different to that shown by the absentee landlords who actually owned the land he farmed. Over his lifetime, he exemplified the role of the resident gentry in rural Ireland. His life as a gentleman farmer saw him live among the community whose interests were tied up with his own. He implemented land improvements and introduced modern farming methods, ideas and equipment to the county. He set up trade links between his home locality here in North Kerry and the London market. He provided employment and actively promoted the tourism industry in Ballybunion. He also played a decisive role in the construction of the railway in North Kerry and the famous Lartigue monorail. All of these actions helped increase the economic productivity of his own estates and increased his own wealth, but they also had a role to play in increasing the prosperity of the wider North Kerry community. These benefits, the railway, the tourism, the export links, continue to be a positive influence in his home locality of North Kerry far beyond his lifetime and even to the present day. And just to conclude to say, his lifestyle at Ennismore, his reputation as a farmer, and his work in public projects show that George Hewson of Ennismore rightly earned the title the Prince Farmer of North Kerry. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I suppose first I'd like to congratulate you on your appointment as historian in residence to Kerry County Council, the first such appointment, and I'm, on behalf of everybody here, I'm sure everyone will join with me in wishing you every success in the role. Secondly, I'd like to point out that no matter how academically qualified somebody is, it's not easy to stand up in front of your community, especially many of those who have known you since you were in short pants, no doubt, and particularly new members of the family in question in the audience. So again, congratulations on that one. Now, as Jimmy has yet to learn, and as Brian McMahon can attest here, and you were learning, people that are, I'm not quite sure what the right should say, recruited or conscripted into the Kerry Archaeological and Historical Society, they never get off with just one job. We keep coming back time after time after time. So Tom has very kindly agreed not only to deliver the lecture tonight, but to write for our magazine, the Kerry magazine. So we'll be looking forward to an article from you as well, Tom, in the near future. Now, with regard to tonight's lecture, I suppose the true mark of a historian, in my opinion, is to be able to bring the subject matter down to the ordinary level. And Tom, certainly you've done that tonight, and you should be very proud of it. I'd really like to commend you on the illustrations and the images. I mean, there are a huge amount of thought, and again, research went into procuring all those images. So, I suppose I'll throw the floor for questions, and I'm sure there are a multiplicity of questions to be asked. So, I'd like to start.
Yes, to have a question, but I just by accident came across a couple of points recently about George and in the 80s, on the water question, there's been held in Tralee, and it had all to do with the fact that I say quite badly what to do is that we were circumventing the quality control situation, and description taken up to offer a reward to find out who did it. And Hewson's, 2 Hewsons were the biggest subscribers, so that they get €20 each. It was by far the biggest amount that they gave. And all the other gentry in that they subscribed went up to £307, which was a lot of money that time. I don't know if it was ever had to be given out. I don't know if the companies were ever found on it, but there were a lot of that were using it.
Anybody else?
Just Tom, the waivers, he did pay for the survey at considerable expense. And one of the secretaries of those companies was a man by the name of Bingham.
Yeah.
The Binghams were very much part of the family.
Was his father-in-law?
Was he the father-in-law?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was fascinating that he actually walked the whole system in that regard.
His father-in-law wrote the system as well, because I think that's how he got the job as secretary of the company. Through George Hewson, because George was the director. Yeah, you know, the difficulty in trying to put all that together tonight was what I left in, because there's just so much history around the man. I mean, I couldn't even talk about his family and who they were. And he married twice. He had the first time he married his cousin from Hewson, and they had one daughter, and she died when she was 18, and she was taken out the front window of Ennismore house. And her governess then, she was educated at home, and George actually fell in love with her governess afterwards and married her. And they had the same name. She had the same name as his daughter, Lily. She was Lily Bingham. And again, they had a big family. Then the second time around, he had a big family second around, and he became known as the grand old man, because he kind of lived 2 lives. You know, his first from being married, you know. So his son George Francis Fitzgerald Hewson, he would have been the last of the family living in Ennismore. It would have been when he died. He didn't have any children, and the estate was eventually sold to local farmers then. So and again there was a whole the prospects of his daughters as well. His daughters were presented in Dublin Castle at the social season when the Lord Lieutenant would have there would be series of grand balls and levees and parties in Dublin Castle, and only the elite of the country would be invited. And again, George Hewson would have been part and parcel of all that. But I mean, you couldn't. There is a book in all this, and this is the whole idea of setting up to do the lecture tonight. What you have to get Claudia for standing on there. You know, when you sign up for the lecture, you have to kind of form it into some kind of story, and you know, this is a bit way ahead in doing that. So it might make writing the book then an awful lot easier, because again, there's just so much history about the man.
The car park, the boys' car park, I know it's very when I grew up there, you know, but there was a Protestant church there.
Yeah.
And there's some lovely photographs of the castle hotel and the church.
Yeah.
But did you were they involved in that church?
Yeah, there were actually, yeah, because George Hewson, he was Church of Ireland, right, and that would have been a Church of Ireland church as well. Generally, they would have come to church here on Sunday, and they would sit on the left-hand side up at the top, and again, that was a kind of a symbolic of their position in the community in the store. They were the biggest tenants of the area of the store, and they were set up there. But there was a big disagreement across the way when there was a new rector in the 1879, I think it was, and when he came in, he appointed a new vestry. A vestry would have been like a parish council, and he picked George Sands. They hated George Sands, who lived down the square here, to be a member of the vestry, and George Hewson then, it seems, up sticks and went out to Ballygunnion, because he served on as the representative of the Church of Ireland Synod. He would have served as the representative for the parish of Kilkenny, as it was.
There's a story in the family where my father actually worked on the dismantling of the church, and I don't know if people know about it, they might know about it, but my father told me that the columns, they were so nice and so well made that they couldn't break them up, so they actually buried them under the car park. There was actually stuff under the car park to be got. The use was involved in it.
That's interesting.
The second thing that comes to mind is the Castle Hotel. In my own personal opinion, it was the biggest act of vandalism. The old building that you mentioned, I didn't realise, you mentioned the date, the 1830s.
Yeah.
I never mentioned that date. That threw me back a small bit. But anyway, where the building, the old part of it, actually that's the picture, that's the one before, that's the one that I would go on, you know.
Yeah.
But the old part, that part there, that was taken down and to below at the side of Puckle's fields, on the bank of the river field. And the stones are there, and to be honest, someone should look at it.
Yeah.
They should actually be taken away from there and used properly. Because what you showed us tonight about George Hewson, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a family in this room tonight that would have connections historically with him. You know? But we lost that.
Yeah.
Character, you know.
Yeah.
Imagine if that was there today, then you put what character we had, you know. But an act of vandalism to knock that over.
Yeah.
Because it was there since the 1820s.
Yeah.
It was actually built by, there was actually a report of the night of the big wind in Ballygunnion, right? And it was said that the hotel recently built by Captain Hewson, that was George's father, was damaged. And also half of Ballygunnion Castle fell into the sea. And what I couldn't mention tonight was that when George bought Ballygunnion, this would have been in 1879, he took out a mortgage of £25,000, right? And eventually he fell behind in the mortgage because there was an agricultural depression in the 1870s, 80s and 90s, and he started to lose a lot of money. So the mortgage institution, the Scottish Parliament, they came in and they took over the running of his estates, and they appointed his nephew, who was also called George Hewson, as their representative. And I often, like, there are different stories in Ballygunnion about how George Hewson, by the way, woke up one morning in a drunken stupor and he decided he wanted to blow up the castle, and it was the locals that stopped him. But I think a lot of the bad stories about George were actually about, not about George of Ennismore, but actually George, who was the agent of the Scottish Parliament. I know definitely in 1914 onwards and in the 1920s, there was a lot of unrest in Ballygunnion over evictions that took place there, and threatened evictions, because the leases that George granted when he came to Ennismore, or he came to Ballygunnion in the 1880s, he was very generous in the length of them and also in the money that he charged. And a lot of these came to an end in around 1914 and onwards. And George Hewson, his nephew, the agent, took the opportunity to maybe double, triple, or even more the rents, and it caused a lot of unrest, as I said. But actually, just to go back to that one point about the castle, there's actually a record in the newspapers at the time that the castle would actually have fallen down, only that George Hewson built the buttress up against the wall. George of Ennismore built the buttress up against the wall. So again, he was a man who appreciated the history of Ballygunnion as well, and also the tourism aspect of it.
How did he keep the salmon so fresh? I mean, manufacturer-wise, I don't think it was there at that time.
Yeah, there was a nice house near the lodge there, a picture of the gate lodge where it started this building. There was a nice house near that, but I'm not sure how they made it. I know I was down in Glencastle this year and they described how ice was actually picked up off the fields in winter time and stored on the ground and places like that to make more ice. So the stories I heard at home was that when the fish would be caught in the river, they would be packed into fish boxes with Fellis drums. These would be like the flag irises, and they'd be carted off straight away, then more or less to Lixna at that time for the train. So I see again the transport links were so quick as well. I'm nearly certain the fish caught in the river here would be in London. The following day would be reasonable, wouldn't it?
There is an issue of ice, that's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
where did they get the ice from?
They're smoking.
That's the-
No, there wouldn't have been any smoking. No. There would have been fresh.
Yeah, electricity to me.
No.
Sorry, in the late 19th century, it was possible to go from Farm Forward, go right by train, onto Rossmere, the boat train, and onto London. And if you left Farm Forward like 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening, you'd be in London midday the following day. So, yeah.
Sorry, it did show that there are two of an ancestor of one of the singing is used to know that it's support they have cultivation. And when we were younger, we used to have here a rhyme that was said that it was written and John Hewson hitched on John Hewson of Ennismore, who fell asleep and walked along No, I was trying to find it myself, but it just, the way it's gone.
Maybe is this something rather than the head? That's not on the headstock, but it's on this, so we'll fell asleep. So maybe that's what it was.
I keep walking around a lot.
What was the question at the
I
start?
asked now, was John?
Oh, yeah.
And then Siskel of Bonwell, was singer, was also used.
Supposedly he is, isn't it? He's descended from the Archdeacon of Hewson. He would have been a grandfather of George's, and the Archdeacon would have lived out in Woodford. Actually, he lived in the nice Kerry's house down by the castle in Woodford, and he died there in the 1780s. But it would have been an ancestor or a descendant of his that Bono would be.
He was a part of the congregation at some stage.
I was hoping he was going to turn up here tonight.
Thanks, Tom, very much. I just want to could you say briefly how the succession went in 1896?
In 1896, you mean
What happened after he died?
what happened after he died? Well, actually, his son was in South Africa when he died. George, his heir, let's say. But then the Scottish Parliament came in and took over Ennismore as well. The family didn't like the agent, the other George, and eventually they left. They actually went up to Dalkey in Dublin, and they stayed there. And finally, then they kind of gave up the place. And in 1908, I think it was, the Earl of Listowel sold Ennismore to the Land Commission, and there was a farm of 200 acres carved out of the estate in Ennismore that would have been centred around the Great House, and George's eldest son came to live there that time. And actually, he eventually came to own Ennismore because he bought it through the Land Commission. So he died then in 1927. The estate passed to his sister, and she brought in the Corbin family, who and Carty's, the farm was divided, and their descendants are still there. So that's what happened in Ennismore. Yeah. Sorry, Ron. Yeah.
Just under that part, where did they get that elephant coat that the woman was?
That picture was taken in Ennismore. This one was I just worried I was going to get you cut me out though, because I shouldn't have heard it about the Ennismore. So the Hewsons and Flew, they were closely related. The Hewsons and Flew would have come from the Ennismore branch. So we mentioned, I just go back to our picture, Margaret Fitzgerald. It would have been her son Morris that would have settled in Flew. So the great house was in Flew at that time as well, and they would have settled in Flew, Morris, and eventually then the Hewson family in Flew. They were operating on a different scale of gentry than the Hewsons of Ennismore, because their farm was pretty small, and they had another farm back around Dyshire, actually. They had a few farms there, and they were generally clergymen. And there was one of them, he was a curate across the way here in St. John's, and eventually they ended up down in Cork, down in Cloyne, where there were the rectors of the churches down there. And the last of them was Billy Hewson. He was a farmer in Flew, and he kind of fell by the wayside of the agricultural depressions I mentioned, the troubled George as well. And he eventually just left Flew with his family and moved to Australia. They settled in their own place, in a place near Brisbane, and they called it Flew as well after their place here. And Billy, I think it was about 2 years that they were out there, and he died out there then. So, yeah, but I think the tragedy with that family was that his wife died, and the family were very young, so they kind of struggled in that regard as well. cope. So yeah, that was what happened with the Hewson of
We take one more question now because I believe there's another event on here this evening. So, final question, please.
Will you launch the book this year?
hopefully one. Will you come?
I will.
Hopefully one will be there.
Sent him an invite.
Is that it?
I'm just sorry. I live in Bally and my home place was part of the George Hewson estate in Bally. Now I knew about Scottish problems owning it, but I know my great grandparents came there in 1910. And as did a whole lot of other farmers. And there were smaller plots than the cottage in the acre. So I'd really like to know how, say, my great grandparents came, how was that land, how was it broken up, and who got, why did some people get it and other people not?
I'll be honest with you, I can't answer that question, but I do know that they were taking rents in Ballymoney up to the 1920s anyway, because George's son actually took them to court because he reckoned that they collected the rents longer than what they were entitled to. They came in and they took all the money of they started receiving the rents to claim back the money that was owed to them. So he reckoned that they actually came back more than what they were entitled. They kept the best longer than what they were entitled, that they should have given it all to him. But I'm not entirely sure how that would have come about actually. I don't even know if they're even still available, because you don't know that, no, you're not aware of that. Yeah, because they still exist, the Scottish Parliament still exists as a mortgage company, so yeah, but I can't answer that question.
All the farms up into say 40 acre parcels. And as I said, then there were smaller plots.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much. Certainly tonight's lecture.